The ballroom went silent the moment I stepped through the doors. More than 200 people turned to look at me. Business executives, investors, employees, board members. And standing in the center of the room holding a champagne glass was my husband. Beside him stood a woman wearing a diamond necklace I had received on our 25th wedding anniversary. A necklace that was supposed to be locked inside my jewelry box at home. The woman smiled confidently until she saw me. Then the color drained from her face. My husband looked like he'd seen a ghost. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Who is that?" I straightened my shoulders inside my army dress uniform. 32 years of military service had taught me many things. How to stay calm under pressure. How to read people. How to wait patiently until the right moment. I looked directly at the woman, then at my husband. And finally I said the words that changed everything. "Hello, David." The room grew even quieter. "I'm Rebecca Carter." I paused. The actual Mrs. Carter. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. And in that moment, the carefully constructed lie my husband had been living for years began to collapse. But before I tell you how I ended up standing in that ballroom, I need to take you back 3 weeks. Back to the day I came home. I had spent 11 months overseas. At 58 years old, I was serving as a colonel in the United States Army and nearing retirement. Most people my age were planning vacations, spending time with grandchildren, or learning how to enjoy slower mornings. I was coordinating military operations halfway around the world. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly it was paperwork planning and responsibility. But I had always believed in service. And for more than 3 decades, my husband David had always claimed he believed in it too. Whenever I apologized for missing holidays or anniversaries, he would smile and tell me not to worry. "We both serve in different ways," he'd say. "You serve the country. I'll keep things running at home." For years I believed him. Maybe that's why what happened hurt so much. Not because of the betrayal itself, but because I never saw it coming. 3 weeks earlier, I received unexpected leave approval. My replacement arrived sooner than anticipated, which meant I could return to Texas almost a month earlier than planned. I decided not to tell David. I wanted to surprise him. The idea seemed romantic, old-fashioned maybe. The kind of thing married couples still did after 30 years together. I imagined showing up at his office, his face lighting up, a long embrace. Maybe dinner at our favorite steakhouse afterward. Simple things. The things you miss when you're away long enough. My flight landed at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on a bright Thursday morning. The Texas sun felt warmer than I remembered. I carried only a small bag and wore my army dress uniform because I was scheduled to attend a military ceremony the following day. Instead of heading home first, I called a rideshare and gave the driver the address of David's company, Carter Logistics Solutions, a business we had built together from almost nothing. Back in the early years, I had helped with bookkeeping on weekends while serving active duty. Every promotion I earned in the Army had also helped create opportunities for his growing business. We were partners, or at least I thought we were. The company headquarters occupied a modern 4-story building in a business district north of Dallas. As we pulled into the parking lot, I felt butterflies in my stomach. I remember laughing at myself. After 30 years of marriage, I was still nervous about surprising my husband. The driver dropped me off near the front entrance. I straightened my uniform jacket and walked toward the security desk. The guard looked to be in his late 20s, friendly enough. He smiled politely. "Good morning, ma'am." "Morning," I said. "I'm here to surprise my husband." "Name?" "Rebecca Carter." He typed something into his computer, then glanced up. "Who are you meeting?" I smiled. "David Carter." The guard nodded. "And your relationship to Mr. Carter?" I actually laughed. "I'm his wife." The reaction caught me completely off guard. The young man laughed too. Not rudely at first. More like someone who thought he'd heard a joke. Then he shook his head. "Good one." I frowned. "I'm sorry." The guard leaned back in his chair. "Ma'am, the boss's wife is already inside." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood him. "The what?" "The boss's wife." He pointed toward the executive elevators. "She's here almost every day." I stared at him. My mind struggled to process what he was saying. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. "There she is now." I turned. A woman in her 40s stepped out of the elevator lobby. Elegant dress, perfect hair, expensive handbag. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Several employees greeted her as she walked past. One man even said, "Morning, Mrs. Carter." "Mrs. Carter." My name, my title, my life. The woman smiled and continued walking toward the parking lot. The security guard looked back at me. See, my stomach tightened. I should have marched straight upstairs. Demanded answers. Created a scene, but military training kicked in. When something doesn't make sense, you don't react emotionally. You gather information. Observe first. Act second. I forced myself to smile. Interesting. The guard shrugged. Sorry about the misunderstanding. I nodded politely. Then I walked back outside. The Texas heat hit me immediately. I sat down on a bench near the parking lot and watched the woman drive away. For nearly 20 minutes I remained there, thinking, breathing, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. The obvious explanation was an affair, but somehow it felt bigger than that. Employees weren't acting like she was a secret girlfriend. They genuinely believed she was Mrs. Carter, which meant this wasn't new. This had been happening for a while. A long while. I pulled out my phone. David had texted me 2 days earlier. Miss you. Can't wait until you come home. Love you. I stared at the message. Then I looked back at the building. For the first time in our marriage, I wondered if I actually knew the man who had sent it. I stood up slowly. I wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. Instead, I booked a room at a nearby hotel. Because something told me that if I wanted the truth, I needed to stop being a wife for a little while and start thinking like an investigator. The moment I checked into that hotel room, I made a decision. I would not call David. I would not confront him. Not yet. Instead, I was going to find out exactly who that woman was, and why half of Dallas seemed to believe she was living my life. The first night in that hotel room, I barely slept. Not because I was angry. At least not yet. Anger requires certainty. And at that point, all I had were questions. I sat beside the window overlooking the Dallas skyline and replayed the scene at the security desk over and over. The guard hadn't looked nervous. He hadn't been covering for anyone. He genuinely believed the woman he pointed to was David Carter's wife. That was the part I couldn't shake. Affairs happen. I've lived long enough to know that. Military life puts enormous pressure on marriages. Long deployments. Missed birthdays. Empty chairs at family dinners. I've seen good marriages survive it and good marriages collapse under it. But what I'd witnessed wasn't simply infidelity. It was something stranger, more deliberate. Somehow another woman had stepped into my place so completely that people accepted her as Mrs. Carter, and nobody seemed to question it, not even for a second. The next morning I started doing what the Army had trained me to do for more than 30 years. Gather information. Patiently. Methodically. Without assumptions. I changed into civilian clothes and drove back to the company headquarters. This time I parked across the street. For nearly 4 hours I sat inside a coffee shop with a view of the entrance. I watched employees arrive. I watched deliveries come and go. And around 9:30 I saw her. The woman. She arrived in a black Mercedes. A valet rushed to open her door. Several employees greeted her warmly. One even carried her handbag inside. Nobody treated her like a visitor. They treated her like family. Like she belonged. Like she was the boss's wife. Over the next 3 days, I continued watching. The pattern became impossible to ignore. She attended executive meetings, joined David for lunches, accompanied him to charity functions, walked through the building with complete authority. Everywhere she went, people called her Mrs. Carter. Not once did anyone correct themselves. Not once did anyone hesitate. It was as if I had never existed. On the 4th day, I decided to dig deeper. I started with social media. That alone nearly broke my heart. Photos. Hundreds of them. Fundraisers. Business dinners. Golf tournaments. Holiday parties. In photo after photo, David and the woman appeared together, standing side by side, smiling, posing, looking exactly like a married couple. Comments underneath the pictures were even worse. What a beautiful couple. You two are relationship goals. Mrs. Carter looks amazing. Nobody questioned it. Nobody knew. Or perhaps nobody cared. I stared at those images for hours. I wasn't jealous. At 58, jealousy felt like a young person's emotion. What I felt was something else. Erasure. As though the last 3 decades of my life had simply been deleted. That evening I called my oldest friend, Margaret. We'd met 27 years earlier at Fort Bragg. She retired as a lieutenant colonel and now lived outside San Antonio. Margaret answered on the second ring. Rebecca. Hey. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I hesitated. Then I told her everything. The security guard. The woman. The photographs. The lies. By the time I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Margaret spoke. You're sure? I wish I wasn't. Another silence. Then she said something that stayed with me. Don't confront him. That's exactly what I was thinking. Good. I need facts. You always do. We both laughed softly. For the first time all week, I felt a little less alone. The next morning, Margaret connected me with another retired officer, a former military investigator named Frank Lawson. Frank was 72 years old and sharp as ever. After listening carefully, he asked only one question. Rebecca, do you believe this is only an affair? I thought about it. No. Neither do I. That answer surprised me. Why? Frank sighed. Because affairs thrive on secrecy. What does that mean? It means people hide them. I knew where he was going. This woman isn't hidden. Exactly. He paused. Someone wanted her seen. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. David wasn't merely cheating. He was presenting her as his wife, publicly, openly, repeatedly, for years. A few days later, I finally learned her name. Vanessa Morgan, 43 years old, former marketing consultant, divorced, no children. I found her listed as a board advisor for several local charities. Interestingly, many of those charities also received donations from David's company. The connections were growing, and I didn't like what I was seeing. Then came the discovery that changed everything. One of my former neighbors called me unexpectedly. Karen had lived across the street from us for nearly 15 years. We hadn't spoken in months. After a few minutes of catching up, she asked a question that made my blood run cold. So when did you move out? I nearly dropped the phone. What? You and David. What are you talking about? There was a long pause. Karen sounded confused. I assumed you moved. Why? Because another woman has been staying there. I felt my heart pounding. How long? Another pause. Then she answered. At least 2 years. 2 years. Not 2 months. Not 6 months. 2 years. I closed my eyes. The room suddenly felt very small. For 2 years, another woman had been walking into my home, sleeping in my bed, using my kitchen, hosting dinners in the house I helped pay for, and all while I was serving overseas. That night I drove past my own house. I parked across the street. The same way I had watched The Office. The lights were on. A familiar porch light glowed beside the front door. The flower beds I had planted years earlier still lined the walkway. Everything looked exactly the same, yet somehow it wasn't my home anymore. At around 8:30, David's SUV pulled into the driveway. A few minutes later, Vanessa came outside. She kissed him. Casually, comfortably, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Then they went inside together. I sat there for nearly an hour, not crying, not screaming, just watching, accepting reality. Sometimes the truth arrives all at once. Sometimes it arrives one painful piece at a time. For me, it was happening piece by piece, and each piece hurt more than the last. Back at the hotel, I spread documents, notes, and photographs across the bed. There was enough evidence now to prove David had built an entirely separate life, but something still bothered me. Something didn't add up. A successful businessman doesn't risk everything for an affair, not unless there's something bigger behind it, something financial, something hidden. The next morning, I called a family attorney I had trusted for years. Her name was Lisa Reynolds. After hearing everything, she asked me to come to her office immediately. When I arrived, she listened quietly and reviewed my notes. Then she leaned back in her chair. Rebecca, I think we need to examine the company's finances. I frowned. Why? Lisa folded her hands together. Because people willing to lie this long about one thing, she paused, are often lying about other things too. As I left her office that afternoon, I had a feeling my marriage wasn't the only thing about to fall apart. And deep down, I was beginning to suspect that David's betrayal went far beyond another woman. The following Monday morning, I sat across from Lisa Reynolds in her downtown Dallas office. The building overlooked a busy stretch of freeway where thousands of people were heading to work, worrying about deadlines, meetings, and ordinary problems. I envied them. A week earlier, I had been worried about whether David would like the surprise I had planned. Now I was trying to determine whether my husband had spent years dismantling the life we'd built together. Lisa slid a legal pad across the desk. Let's start with everything you jointly own. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed our finances. The house, retirement accounts, investments, business interests, savings, things I hadn't thought about in years. David had always handled most of the company's financial operations, not because I couldn't, simply because marriage requires trust, or at least it should. I trusted him, the same way he trusted me to protect his life when I carried a weapon overseas, the same way he trusted me to represent our family while serving in uniform. Trust isn't supposed to be complicated. That's why betrayal hurts so much. By Wednesday, Lisa had assigned a forensic accountant to review publicly available records connected to Carter Logistics Solutions. His name was Michael Bennett, a quiet man in his 60s with reading glasses that constantly slid down his nose. He reminded me of a favorite high school teacher, the kind who notices details everyone else misses. When we met for the first time, he carried 3 thick folders. That immediately concerned me. 3 folders meant work. A lot of work. Michael sat down, opened the first folder, and sighed. Colonel Carter. I hadn't heard that title spoken in days. For some reason, it comforted me. Yes, I think you have a much bigger problem than an affair. My stomach tightened. Show me. For the next hour, Michael walked me through a complicated web of transactions. Some were small, others weren't. Large consulting fees, questionable vendor contracts, property purchases, corporate transfers. At first glance, everything appeared legitimate. But once Michael began connecting the dots, a disturbing picture emerged. Money was moving. A lot of money. And much of it seemed connected to Vanessa Morgan. I stared at the documents. How much are we talking about? Michael adjusted his glasses. Potentially several $1 million. The room suddenly felt colder. Several million. Not thousands. Not hundreds of thousands. Millions. I had expected heartbreak. I had expected lies. I had not expected financial betrayal on this scale. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Several companies receiving payments from Carter Logistics appeared to have connections to Vanessa. One was registered under a former business partner of hers. Another listed an address tied to a family member. A third had virtually no business activity at all. Yet money continued flowing into it. Month after month. Year after year. Lisa leaned forward. David knew exactly what he was doing. I nodded slowly. There was no other explanation. These weren't mistakes. They were decisions. Careful, intentional, calculated decisions. What hurt most wasn't the money. At 58 years old, I'd learned that money comes and goes. You can lose a house, lose investments, lose possessions. What truly hurts is discovering someone you love has been lying while looking directly into your eyes. That's harder to recover from. A few days later, Michael uncovered another troubling detail. David had recently begun restructuring ownership percentages within the company. The timing caught everyone's attention, especially Lisa's. She reviewed the paperwork several times before speaking. When were you supposed to return from deployment? About 3 weeks from now. She nodded. Interesting. What is... Lisa turned the documents toward me. These transfers were scheduled to continue over the next 6 months. I studied the dates. A cold realization settled over me. David thought he still had time. He believed I was overseas. He believed I wouldn't be back yet. Which meant he had been in the middle of something when I unexpectedly arrived home. Something unfinished. Something important. That weekend, another piece of the puzzle appeared. An old friend called me. His name was Jim Harper. He had worked for David for nearly 15 years before retiring. I'd always liked Jim. Steady. Honest. The kind of man who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards. When he heard I was back in Texas, he asked to meet for coffee. We chose a diner near Plano. Nothing fancy. Just eggs, coffee, and quiet conversation. After a few minutes of small talk, Jim grew serious. I almost didn't call. Why? He looked uncomfortable. Because I wasn't sure how much you knew. Knew about what? He stared into his coffee, then finally answered. Things changed after you deployed. My heart sank. What kind of things? Jim sighed. A lot of longtime employees left. That surprised me. David had always valued loyalty, or at least I thought he had. Why? Jim shook his head. Most weren't fired. Then what happened? They were pushed out. I frowned. By who? He looked directly at me. Vanessa. For nearly an hour, Jim told me stories. Employees with decades of experience suddenly finding themselves excluded from meetings. Trusted managers being replaced. Longtime staff members resigning after conflicts with Vanessa. People who questioned her authority mysteriously disappearing from leadership positions. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Loyal employees were removed. Supporters were promoted. Little by little, Vanessa's influence grew. And David allowed it. Maybe even encouraged it. Then Jim shared something that cut deeper than everything else. Something I still remember word for word. We had finished eating. The waitress had refilled our coffee. Jim hesitated before speaking. I probably shouldn't tell you this. Tell me anyway. He looked away. David used to make jokes. I felt a knot form in my chest. What kind of jokes? Jim swallowed, then quietly answered. He'd say his wife loved the army more than she loved her marriage. For a moment I couldn't speak, not because I was shocked, because I was hurt, deeply hurt. I had missed birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, family gatherings, not because I wanted to, because service required sacrifice. David knew that. He had supported that, or at least I believed he had. To hear that he had mocked those sacrifices behind my back felt worse than the affair itself, worse than the money, worse than the lies, because it meant he had rewritten our story, the story we'd spent 30 years building together. That night I sat alone in my hotel room. A photograph rested on the nightstand, one I had carried overseas. David and I standing together at my promotion ceremony years earlier. He had looked proud, genuinely proud, or maybe I had imagined it. Now I wasn't sure. I picked up the photograph and studied it for a long time, trying to figure out when everything changed, trying to identify the exact moment my husband stopped being my partner and became someone I no longer recognized. I never found the answer. The following week, Lisa called with news. We're ready. I looked up from my notes. Ready for what? The next step. I knew exactly what she meant. For nearly 2 weeks we had gathered evidence, documents, financial records, witness statements, corporate filings, photographs, everything. Piece by piece we had assembled the truth, and now the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Lisa's voice remained calm. Rebecca, if we're going to do this, we need to do it properly. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I agree. David still doesn't know you're here. No? Good. That single word carried enormous weight. Good. Because surprise had become my greatest advantage. David thought I was thousands of miles away. He thought his secrets were safe. He thought he still controlled the narrative. What he didn't realize was that the evidence against him was already stacked neatly inside several folders sitting on my hotel desk. And very soon those folders were going to be opened in front of people whose opinions mattered far more than mine. People with the power to destroy everything he'd spent years trying to protect. The trap wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't revenge fueled by anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was the truth. And the truth was finally ready to be revealed. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Not to me, of course. To investors, board members, business partners, and local media. David was hosting a celebration, a major company event announcing a new expansion project. The kind of event designed to attract attention. Photos, press coverage, public recognition, a victory lap. When Lisa showed me the invitation, I almost laughed. The timing couldn't have been more ironic. For years, David had carefully managed appearances. Now he was about to put all of his most important relationships into one room. Investors, board members, industry leaders, everyone whose trust he depended on. And he was doing it voluntarily. Sometimes people create their own downfall. They just don't realize it. The event was scheduled for a Friday evening at a luxury hotel in downtown Dallas. The ballroom could hold nearly 300 guests. According to Lisa, attendance would be impressive. Several major investors were expected. A few local politicians, business reporters, community leaders, the entire board of directors. Exactly the kind of audience David would want. And exactly the kind of audience that needed to hear the truth. The week leading up to the event felt strangely peaceful. Not because I wasn't nervous. I was. But after years in the army, I'd learned something important. Preparation reduces fear. And we were prepared. Every document had been reviewed. Every statement verified. Every piece of evidence organized. There would be no emotional outburst. No dramatic screaming. No scenes from a television show. Just facts. Carefully documented facts. The kind that are difficult to argue with. Snai. On Friday afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror inside my hotel room. My army dress uniform fit perfectly. The same uniform I had worn at promotion ceremonies, military funerals, retirement celebrations, and official functions across 3 decades. The uniform represented service, duty, integrity, values that had guided my life, values that suddenly felt more important than ever. I adjusted the ribbons above my pocket, smoothed my jacket, and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 3 weeks earlier, but she also looked stronger. There comes a point when heartbreak stops making you feel small. Instead, it reminds you who you are. That moment had finally arrived. Lisa met me in the hotel lobby. She carried a briefcase. Inside were copies of everything: financial records, corporate filings, supporting documents, enough evidence to answer every question that might arise. She smiled. "You ready?" I thought about it, then nodded. Yes. For the first time since returning home, I truly meant it. The ballroom was already crowded when we arrived. Through the partially open doors, I could hear laughter and conversation, glasses clinking, music playing softly, people celebrating. Inside, David was probably enjoying himself, confident, comfortable, completely unaware of what was about to happen. For a brief moment, I considered turning around, not because I was afraid, because part of me still loved the man I had married. 30 years doesn't disappear overnight. Even after betrayal, even after lies, a small piece of my heart wished none of this had happened. But wishes don't change reality. Truth does. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room didn't notice me immediately. Why would they? I was simply another guest entering a crowded ballroom. But as I moved farther inside, heads began turning. People noticed the uniform first. Then they noticed me. Several older employees looked confused, as if they recognized something familiar but couldn't quite place it. I continued walking, steady, calm, purposeful, toward the stage, toward David. He was standing near the front of the room holding a champagne glass. Beside him stood Vanessa. She wore an elegant navy blue dress. Around her neck hung the diamond necklace David had given me on our 25th anniversary. The sight still hurt, but not as much as it would have a week earlier. By then I had already accepted the truth. The necklace was merely a symbol. The real betrayal ran much deeper. Then David saw me. I watched the exact moment recognition appeared. His smile vanished. The color drained from his face. The champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. For several seconds he simply stared, as if his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Vanessa noticed his reaction. Then she turned, and saw me too. Her expression shifted immediately. Confidence, confusion, fear, all within a few seconds. The room grew quieter. Conversations began fading. People sensed something unusual was happening. I stopped a few feet away, close enough for David to hear every word, far enough to maintain dignity. Neither of us spoke initially. The silence itself was powerful. Finally, I broke it. "Hello, David." His mouth opened slightly. No sound emerged. I had seen soldiers react more calmly during emergencies. "Oh." A few guests exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" I looked around the room, at the employees, the investors, the board members, the people who deserved honesty. Then I answered the question myself. "My name is Rebecca Carter." More silence. I continued. "I've been married to David Carter for 30 years. The reaction was immediate. Several people visibly stiffened. Others looked toward Vanessa, then back toward me. Confusion spread through the room, a ripple moving from table to table. I glanced at the necklace, then at Vanessa. "I'm also the woman who received that necklace from my husband on our 25th wedding anniversary." Vanessa instinctively touched it, as though suddenly aware everyone was looking. David finally found his voice. "Rebecca." It was barely a whisper. I turned toward him. "No." My tone remained calm. "Tonight isn't about explanations." The room remained completely silent. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. One of the board members approached cautiously, an older gentleman named Robert Simmons. I recognized him from company photographs. "Mrs. Carter." "Yes." His expression tightened. "I think perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere private." I shook my head gently. Ordinarily, I would agree. Then I looked toward the board members seated nearby. "But the information I'm about to share affects this company." Robert immediately understood. His face grew serious, very serious. Lisa stepped forward. She opened her briefcase, removed several folders, and handed copies to key board members. The atmosphere changed instantly. This was no longer a personal dispute. This was business. For the next 20 minutes, Lisa calmly presented evidence. Financial transfers, questionable consulting agreements, corporate transactions connected to Vanessa, documentation, dates, amounts, records. No accusations, just facts. The room became quieter with every page. Board members exchanged increasingly concerned looks. Investors began asking questions. The answers were not reassuring. I never raised my voice, never insulted David, never attacked Vanessa. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke far more effectively than anger ever could. One board member removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another requested immediate access to additional financial records. A third quietly asked corporate counsel to join the discussion. The celebration had transformed into an emergency meeting. David stood frozen through most of it, his carefully constructed image collapsing in real time. Not because I destroyed it, because the truth did. Eventually he looked at me. For the first time all evening I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear of consequences, real consequences. Professional, financial, legal. Consequences he could no longer avoid. And as I looked around that ballroom, I realized something important. This wasn't revenge. Not anymore. Revenge is about making someone suffer. What was happening here was accountability. And accountability had finally arrived. By the end of the evening, the board had scheduled an emergency investigation. Outside auditors would be brought in. Corporate records would be reviewed. Nothing would remain hidden. As guests slowly left the ballroom, I watched David standing alone near the stage. For the first time in 30 years, he looked like a stranger. And deep down, I knew his biggest losses hadn't even begun yet. The investigation began the following Monday. Unlike television dramas, real investigations move slowly. There are no dramatic music cues. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Just long hours, documents, interviews, accountants, lawyers, questions, and eventually answers. For the first time since returning home, I checked out of the hotel and rented a small furnished apartment near a lake outside Dallas. I needed distance. Distance from David. Distance from our house. Distance from everything that had once felt familiar. Every morning I would sit on a small balcony with coffee and watch ducks move across the water. It was peaceful, at least on the surface. Inside I still felt like someone rebuilding after a storm. Within 2 weeks, the board suspended David from his leadership position, pending the outcome of the investigation. The announcement made local business news. Several major investors demanded explanations. Some business partners paused negotiations. Others quietly walked away. Trust is difficult to earn, easy to lose, and nearly impossible to recover once people believe you've been dishonest, especially in business. I wasn't attending board meetings, but Lisa kept me informed. The findings grew worse with each report. Some of the financial transfers had violated company policies. Several contracts should never have been approved. Corporate funds had been used in ways that raised serious concerns. While criminal charges were never discussed, civil liability quickly became a possibility. The board's priority was protecting the company. And protecting the company meant protecting it from David. Vanessa disappeared almost immediately. That part surprised me less than anything else. 1 week she was attending charity luncheons and posing for photographs. The next week she was nowhere to be found. No social media updates, no public appearances, no company events. Gone. As if someone had switched off a light. People who had once praised her suddenly avoided mentioning her name. Funny how quickly loyalty changes when money and status disappear. One afternoon I received a call from Jim Harper. "Have you heard? Heard what?" Vanessa left town. I wasn't shocked. Where'd she go? No idea. I looked out toward the lake. Do you think she ever loved him? The question surprised even me. Jim was quiet for a moment. Then he answered carefully. I honestly don't know. Neither did I. And strangely enough, it no longer mattered. 3 months after the investigation began, the board reached its decision. David would no longer lead Carter Logistics Solutions. His ownership interests would be significantly reduced under a settlement agreement. Additional legal proceedings would resolve the remaining financial disputes. The company survived, but David's position within it did not. When Lisa called with the news, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Very tired. Because the truth is, winning doesn't always feel the way people imagine, especially when the person who loses is someone you once loved. The financial settlement itself was substantial. Years of shared assets, business interests, property, investments, everything had to be divided. The final numbers weren't important to me. Not really. I had spent most of my adult life living comfortably but modestly. The settlement provided security. Nothing more. And honestly, security was enough. At my age, peace mattered more than luxury. Friends wanted me to celebrate. Margaret certainly did. She drove up from San Antonio and insisted on taking me to dinner. Halfway through the meal, she raised a glass. To Rebecca Carter, I laughed. What exactly are we celebrating? You survived. That answer caught me off guard. Margaret smiled. No bitterness, no revenge obsession. No self-destruction. She lifted her glass again. You survived. This time I raised mine too, because maybe she was right. A few weeks later, I received a text message from David. The first direct message since the ballroom. Would you meet me? I stared at the phone for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part knew avoidance wouldn't bring closure. Eventually, I agreed. Oh. We met at a quiet restaurant outside the city. The kind of place where retired couples linger over coffee and nobody pays attention to strangers. When David walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence he once carried had disappeared. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. Thank you for coming. I nodded. You're welcome. Then another silence settled between us. 30 years together, and suddenly we felt like strangers. Eventually, he looked down at his hands. I don't know where to start. Start with the truth. His eyes closed briefly. Then he nodded. Fair enough. For the next hour, David told me things I should have heard years earlier. Not excuses. Not justifications. Truth. Or at least what he believed was the truth. He talked about feeling overshadowed. About insecurity. About watching people admire my military career while viewing him simply as my husband. At first, I struggled to understand. Then I remembered something important. Pain doesn't always make people stronger. Sometimes it makes them selfish. I was proud of you, he said quietly. Then why did you mock me? His face tightened. He knew exactly what I meant. Jim's story. The jokes. The comments. David looked ashamed. Because it was easier. Easier than what? Easier than admitting I felt left behind. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. I convinced myself you loved the army more than you loved me. I stared at him. You knew that wasn't true. I know that now. The answer was heartbreaking. Because deep down, I think he knew it then too. Boom. People often imagine betrayal comes from hatred. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it comes from weakness, insecurity, fear. Poor choices repeated over and over until they become something unforgivable. That realization didn't excuse what David had done, but it helped me understand it. And understanding is often the first step toward peace. As lunch ended, David looked at me. There were tears in his eyes. The first I'd seen throughout this entire ordeal. I'm sorry, Rebecca. The words hung in the air. Simple words, late words, but sincere words. I believed that. For a long moment I studied the man sitting across from me. The man I had loved. The man who had broken my heart. The man who had ultimately destroyed his own life far more thoroughly than I ever could have. And for the first time since coming home, I didn't feel anger. I felt sadness. A deep sadness for everything we had lost. Everything we could have been. And everything that would never be again. As we stood to leave, David asked one final question. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? I looked at him carefully, then answered honestly, I don't know. And at that moment, it was the most truthful answer I could give. 6 months after my meeting with David, I officially retired from the United States Army. 32 years. When I first raised my right hand and took the oath, I was 26 years old. I had no idea where life would take me. I certainly never imagined I would end my career as a colonel. And I definitely never imagined I would be retiring while rebuilding my life from the ground up. Life has a way of surprising us. Not always pleasantly, but sometimes the unexpected becomes the beginning of something better. The retirement ceremony was held on a warm spring afternoon. Family, friends, fellow soldiers, former commanders, people from different chapters of my life gathered together. Margaret sat in the front row. Jim was there too. Even Lisa attended. As I looked around the room, I noticed something interesting. For months I had focused on what I had lost. A marriage, a home, a future I thought was guaranteed. But standing there that afternoon, I saw something else. I saw what remained. Friendship, respect, community, purpose. The things that truly matter. The things betrayal cannot take away. After the ceremony, several younger officers approached me. They asked questions about leadership, service, retirement, life after the military. One young captain looked particularly nervous. Ma'am, she said, what's the most important thing you've learned? I smiled. There were hundreds of possible answers, but only one felt right. Never build your entire identity around one person. She nodded thoughtfully. I hoped she understood, because it had taken me nearly 60 years to learn that lesson myself. A few weeks later, I began volunteering with a veterans transition program. The organization helped former service members adjust to civilian life. Many struggled with uncertainty. Some felt lost. Others felt forgotten. I understood those feelings better than I ever expected to. Every Wednesday I met with veterans looking for jobs, housing, or simply someone willing to listen. The work was meaningful and surprisingly healing. Helping other people reminded me that pain isn't the end of a story. Sometimes it's the beginning of a new chapter. Sue. One afternoon nearly a year after returning home, I received a letter. Not an email, not a text message, a handwritten letter. The envelope carried a familiar name, David Carter. For several minutes I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. The letter was only 3 pages long. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify his choices, no requests to get back together. Just honesty. The kind of honesty that should have existed years earlier. He wrote about regret, about accountability, about therapy, about learning to accept responsibility instead of blaming others. Most importantly, he wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for the years we shared. Gratitude for the sacrifices I made. Gratitude for the life we built before everything fell apart. When I finished reading, I sat quietly for a long time. Then I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because I wanted to forget it, because I wanted to remember it. People often ask whether I ever forgave David. The answer is yes, eventually I did. But probably not for the reason most people expect. I didn't forgive him because he deserved it. Forgiveness isn't a reward. I forgave him because carrying bitterness was exhausting. Anger is heavy. Resentment is heavy. At some point, you realize you're carrying a burden that belongs to someone else, and you finally decide to set it down. That doesn't mean I forgot. It doesn't mean I trusted him again. And it certainly doesn't mean we got back together. We didn't. Some chapters are meant to end. But endings don't have to be cruel. Sometimes they can simply be final. A few months later, David and I met one last time. Not to discuss legal matters. Not to revisit the past. Just coffee. 2 people acknowledging a shared history. Nothing more. We talked about ordinary things. Mutual friends. Retirement. Health. Life. When the conversation ended, neither of us cried. Neither of us argued. We simply wished each other well. And that was enough. Not every story requires a dramatic conclusion. Sometimes peace arrives quietly. Today, as I tell this story, I'm sitting at a community event hosted by the Veterans Organization where I volunteer. Children are playing nearby. Families are gathered around picnic tables. Old soldiers are sharing stories. The sun is beginning to set. It's a good day. A peaceful day. The kind of day I once feared I would never have again. A few years ago, I believed my story was ending. Now I realize it was only changing direction. Looking back, people sometimes describe what happened as revenge. I understand why. There was a public revelation. There were consequences. David lost the company he worked so hard to build. His reputation suffered. His relationship with Vanessa collapsed. From the outside, it probably looks like revenge. But that's not how I see it. The greatest revenge wasn't exposing him. It wasn't winning a settlement. It wasn't watching his lies unravel. The greatest revenge was refusing to let his betrayal define the rest of my life. That's what truly mattered. Because when someone hurts you deeply, there is always a choice. You can spend years living inside that wound. Or you can keep moving forward. Slowly. Painfully. One step at a time. Until the wound becomes a scar. And the scar becomes part of your story instead of your identity. If there's one lesson I hope people take from my experience, it's this. The truth may arrive later than you want. Justice may take longer than you expect. And healing may happen more slowly than you'd like. But none of those things are impossible. As long as you keep going. As long as you keep choosing dignity over bitterness. As long as you remember that another person's betrayal does not determine your worth. See? Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. If this journey reminded you of someone you've loved, forgiven, or lost, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on that person today. And if you've ever faced betrayal and found a way to move forward with grace, know that you're not alone. Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences. Stories have a way of helping us heal together. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, family, and second chances, I invite you to join us again for another journey. Take care of yourself, and remember sometimes the best years of your life are still waiting ahead. 60 missed calls. That was what I saw when I finally turned my phone back on. 60 missed calls, 23 text messages, 7 voicemails. Every single one from people who hadn't bothered to stand up for me 2 days earlier. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the screen while my husband drank coffee across from me. Outside, a light Virginia snow drifted past the window. Inside, my phone kept vibrating. Mom, Dad, my brother Michael, my Aunt Carol, my cousin Jim, even relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, the same people who had watched my father reject my family at his front door, the same people who had said absolutely nothing. I picked up the phone and listened to the first voicemail. My mother's voice was shaking. Sarah, please call us back. Something's happened. I deleted it. Then I played the second one. This time it was my father. Sarah, we need to talk. 2 days earlier, he hadn't wanted to talk. 2 days earlier, he had blocked a doorway. Funny how quickly things can change. But before I tell you why my phone suddenly became the most popular number in Ohio, I need to tell you how we ended up standing on that front porch in the first place. Because family stories don't start with a single bad day. They start with years of small moments that people pretend not to notice. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 42 years old. I've served in the United States Navy for almost 20 years. At the time all this happened, I was stationed near Norfolk, Virginia, working as a commander responsible for logistics operations. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody made movies about it. But I was proud of it. I had spent most of my adult life serving my country. What mattered more to me, though, was the family I had built. My husband David taught American history at a public high school. He was patient, thoughtful, and the exact opposite of me in many ways. Where I liked schedules and plans, David liked conversations and possibilities. Where I was practical, he was compassionate. Together we balanced each other. And then there was Emily, David's daughter from his first marriage, 14 years old.
Right.
Funny, a little shy. I met her when she was 7. By the time this story begins, I honestly forgot she wasn't biologically mine. She was simply my daughter. At least to me. Unfortunately, not everyone felt that way. Especially my father. Christmas leave had been difficult to get that year. The Navy wasn't exactly generous with holiday scheduling. Several officers were competing for the same dates. I pulled favors, traded assignments, and rearranged commitments just to make it happen. When my leave was finally approved, I called my mother. Looks like we're coming home for Christmas. She sounded thrilled. Your father will be happy. That should have been my first warning. Whenever Mom told me how someone else would feel, it usually meant she wasn't sure herself. Still, I ignored it. I wanted a good Christmas. I wanted normal. The drive from Virginia to Ohio took almost 14 hours with holiday traffic. David drove the first stretch. I took over after lunch. Emily slept in the back seat with headphones on. We passed frozen fields, small towns, truck stops, and church signs decorated for Christmas Eve services. The farther north we drove, the more excited I became. Not because my childhood had been perfect. It hadn't. But because some part of me still hoped things would get better. Maybe that's what daughters do. No matter how old they get, they keep hoping. As we crossed into Ohio, David reached over and squeezed my hand. You okay? Just tired. You nervous? A little. He smiled knowingly. Your father... I laughed. Is it that obvious? It has been 15 years, Sarah. He wasn't wrong. David knew my family history almost as well as I did, especially where my father was concerned. Tom Mitchell wasn't a bad man, at least not in the way people usually mean. He never drank too much, never gambled, never disappeared. He worked hard his entire life, provided for his family, paid his bills, went to church, helped neighbors. By most standards, he was respectable. But there was one thing my father had never figured out. How to love people who didn't fit the picture in his head. And nobody fit that picture less than me. Growing up, my younger brother Michael was the center of Dad's world. Michael liked sports. Dad loved sports. Michael hunted. Dad hunted. Michael stayed close to home. Dad approved. Then there was me. I read books, joined debate club, left Ohio, joined the military, married a teacher, became a stepmother. Every major decision I made seemed to disappoint him. He never said it directly. Not often. Instead, he communicated through sighs, looks, comments disguised as jokes. You always were stubborn. You never do things the easy way. Well, that's certainly different. Over time, I learned how to translate. Different meant wrong. Independent meant difficult. Successful meant surprising. By the time we pulled into my parents' neighborhood, snow covered the lawns and rooftops. The house looked exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier. White siding, green shutters, the same wreath hanging on the front door. Mom's minivan sat in the driveway. Michael's truck was already there. I checked my watch. We were right on time. David grabbed gifts from the trunk. Emily carried a pie we'd bought at a bakery along the way. We walked up the front steps together. For one brief moment, everything felt hopeful. Then the front door opened. My father stepped outside. Not inside. Outside. That should have been my second warning. He didn't smile. Didn't say Merry Christmas. Didn't hug me. He simply stood in the doorway, blocking it. I stopped walking. Hi, Dad. His eyes moved past me. Toward David. Toward Emily. Then he folded his arms. Blood family only. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. What? Blood family only. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if he were discussing the weather. He pointed directly at my husband and my stepdaughter. They don't belong here. The world went strangely quiet. I could hear Christmas music playing inside the house. I could smell turkey. Someone laughed in another room. Nobody came to the door. Nobody interrupted. Emily's hand found mine. I felt her fingers trembling. David stood completely still. My father looked at me expectantly, waiting, as if this were perfectly reasonable, as if I should simply understand. Years of disappointment suddenly became crystal clear. Not because of what he said, because of how easily he said it. Like he'd been thinking it for years. I looked past him. I saw relatives gathered around the dining room table. Some noticed what was happening. None moved. None spoke. My father waited. I nodded once. Got it. Then I turned around, took Emily's hand, walked back to the car, and drove away. The first 30 minutes of the drive were completely silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence. Not the kind that exists between people who don't need words. This silence felt heavy. It sat in the car with us, beside us, between us. Snow drifted across the highway while Christmas lights faded in the distance behind us. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. My eyes stayed fixed on the road. If I looked at David or Emily, I knew I might cry. And I wasn't ready to do that yet. Finally, David spoke. Do you want me to drive? I shook my head. No. A few more miles passed. Then Emily's voice came quietly from the back seat. Did I do something wrong? The question hit harder than anything my father had said. I looked into the rearview mirror. She was staring down at her hands. 14 years old. Old enough to understand rejection. Too young to deserve it. No, sweetheart. Then why didn't Grandpa want me there? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because what answer could I give? Should I tell her that some people value blood more than love? Should I explain that my father had spent decades deciding who belonged and who didn't? Should I tell her that the problem wasn't her? David turned around in his seat. This isn't about you. She nodded politely, the way children do when they know adults are trying to protect them. But I could see the hurt in her eyes, and that hurt would stay with me long after Christmas ended. We stopped at a roadside diner 3 hours later. Nobody was hungry. Still, David insisted. You need coffee? Probably. And Emily needs food. That earned the first small smile of the day from her. Inside the diner was warm. An older waitress wearing a Santa pin greeted us. Merry Christmas. 3 simple words. Nothing special. Yet somehow they nearly broke me. Because strangers had shown us more kindness than my own father. We sat in a booth near the window. Emily ordered pancakes. David ordered soup. I ordered coffee and barely touched it. The waitress noticed. You folks traveling, heading back to Virginia. Long drive. I nodded. Very long. She smiled sympathetically. Well, wherever you're going, I hope it's home. After she walked away, none of us spoke for a moment. Then David reached across the table. She has no idea how right she is. That was when the tears finally came. Not dramatic tears. Not sobbing. Just quiet tears running down my face while Christmas music played softly through the restaurant speakers. I wiped them away quickly. Emily got up from her seat and slid into the booth beside me. Without saying anything, she leaned her head against my shoulder. That was family. Not blood. Not DNA. Not legal documents. Just showing up when someone hurts. By the time we got home late that night, all 3 of us were exhausted. I carried luggage inside while David started a fire in the living room. Emily went upstairs. A few minutes later, she came back down carrying a small wrapped package. I was going to give this to Grandpa. She placed it on the coffee table. I recognized the wrapping paper. She had spent 2 weeks making that gift. A framed photo collage of family memories, vacations, birthdays, school events, pictures that included my parents, pictures that included her, pictures she clearly believed mattered. Now she wasn't sure. Do you still want to send it? I asked gently. She stared at the package, then shook her head. No. That one word told me everything. Children rarely remember exact conversations, but they remember how people make them feel. And my father had made her feel unwanted. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Years in the Navy had trained my body to ignore weekends and holidays. I made coffee and sat alone in the kitchen. For the first time in a long time, I let myself think honestly about my father. Not the version I kept defending. The real version. The one I'd spent years making excuses for. The truth was that Christmas hadn't come out of nowhere. It was simply the latest chapter. There had been dozens before it. I remembered graduating high school at the top of my class. Dad skipped the ceremony because Michael had a baseball tournament. I remembered receiving my Navy commission. Dad attended but spent most of the event complaining about travel expenses. I remembered buying my first home. Dad congratulated me by asking whether I planned to settle down and find a normal career. The pattern was always the same. Michael's achievements were celebrated. Mine were evaluated. Michael received praise. I received advice. And whenever I pointed it out, Mom would say, "That's just how your father is." A phrase familiar to millions of Americans. 3 generations of emotional damage hidden behind 7 simple words. That's just how he is. As if that excused everything. By lunchtime, messages from relatives started arriving. Not unusual holiday greetings. Questions. Where are you? Why did you leave? What happened? Apparently, several family members had noticed our absence after dinner. Nobody had stopped us from leaving. But some were curious afterward. I ignored every message. I wasn't interested in reliving the scene. Later that afternoon, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, she called again. Then again. And again. By evening, there were 9 missed calls. David noticed. You going to answer? No. You sure? Very. For once, I didn't feel guilty. That surprised me. Normally, I would have rushed to fix things. Smooth things over. Keep the peace. But something had changed on that front porch. Maybe I had finally reached my limit. Or maybe seeing Emily get hurt had done what decades of personal disappointment couldn't. It forced me to stop pretending. That evening, we started our own Christmas celebration. Just the 3 of us. We ordered takeout. Watched an old movie. Opened presents. Laughed. Slowly, the tension eased. By bedtime, Emily seemed happier. David seemed relaxed. Even I felt lighter. Then the next morning, everything changed. I woke up and discovered my phone had been accidentally left on silent overnight. The screen lit up like a Christmas tree. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. Dozens of them. Far more than before. I frowned. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Because nobody calls that many times unless there's a crisis. I counted. 20 calls. Then 30. Then 40. By noon, the number had climbed even higher. My stomach tightened. I looked at David. He looked back at me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I picked up the phone and saw a voicemail from someone I never expected. Grandma Rose's attorney. I stared at the screen for several seconds before opening the voicemail. Grandma Rose's attorney. That alone was unusual. The man handled estate planning trusts and legal paperwork for my grandmother. He wasn't someone who casually called family members during Christmas week. I pressed play. Commander Mitchell, this is Richard Harlan. Please contact me as soon as possible regarding your grandmother. Nothing is wrong medically, but there have been some significant developments that require your attention. The message ended. I listened again. Then a third time. David was standing beside me. What does that mean? I have absolutely no idea. My phone rang again before I could say anything else. Mom. I declined the call. Immediately another one appeared. Dad. Declined. Then Michael. Declined. The phone rang so many times that it almost became ridiculous. The people who couldn't be bothered to stop my humiliation were suddenly desperate to reach me. I wasn't interested in rewarding that behavior. Not yet. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I called Mr. Harlan's office. He answered personally. Commander Mitchell. Mr. Harlan, what's going on? There was a brief pause. I think it would be better discussed in person. I'm in Virginia. I understand. Another pause. Then he sighed. Your grandmother made several major legal changes on Christmas Day. I sat down slowly. What kind of changes? Changes involving her estate trust administration and charitable foundation? My stomach tightened. Grandma Rose wasn't wealthy in the billionaire sense, but she had done very well for herself. After my grandfather passed away 20 years earlier, she invested wisely sold farmland at exactly the right time and accumulated considerable assets, several $1 million worth. More importantly, she controlled a charitable foundation that funded scholarships and community programs throughout our county. Everyone in the family knew about it. Everyone assumed they knew what would happen when she eventually passed away. Apparently they were wrong. What does this have to do with me? Another pause. Mrs. Rose Mitchell specifically requested your involvement. That got my attention. My involvement, how? She named you successor trustee. I blinked. What? You are now designated as primary successor trustee of her estate. For a moment I thought I'd misunderstood him. That role carried enormous responsibility, financial oversight, asset management, distribution authority. It wasn't something people handed out casually, especially not in families where multiple children and grandchildren existed. My grandmother did this 2 days ago. Yes, and she's healthy. Quite healthy. Then why? Mr. Harlan hesitated. Professional lawyers are careful people. They don't like discussing family disputes. Finally, he chose his words carefully. Your grandmother was deeply disturbed by events she witnessed on Christmas Eve. The room suddenly felt very quiet. David and I exchanged glances. So Grandma knew. Of course she knew. She'd probably heard about it before dinner ended. Small-town Ohio families aren't exactly famous for keeping secrets. What exactly changed, I asked. That is something your grandmother would prefer to discuss personally. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat motionless for almost a minute. My phone continued vibrating. Call after call, message after message. The panic on the other end was obvious. David folded his arms. So, you think this is about your father? I laughed bitterly. When isn't it? By late afternoon, another voicemail arrived. This one was from Aunt Carol. I almost deleted it. Then curiosity won. Sarah, please call us. Nobody knew Grandma would react like this. I froze. React like what? A second voicemail followed. This time from my cousin Jim. Look, people are upset. Grandma's serious. You need to call. Serious. That word appeared repeatedly. Serious. Very serious. Extremely serious. Whatever had happened after Christmas dinner had shaken the entire family. And somehow I was sitting in the center of it without knowing why. That evening I finally called Grandma directly. She answered on the second ring. Hello, sweetheart. Her voice sounded perfectly normal. Strong. Calm. Exactly like always. Grandma. Merry Christmas. The simple greeting nearly made me laugh. Merry Christmas. I suppose everyone's been calling. Constantly. Good. I wasn't expecting that answer. Good. Let them squirm. I leaned back in my chair. For 86 years old, Grandma Rose still knew how to surprise people. Grandma, what happened? What happened is your father embarrassed himself. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. Just facts. He embarrassed the family. I remained quiet. She continued. You drove 14 hours to be there. Yes. You brought your husband. Yes. You brought your daughter. I smiled slightly. Grandma always called Emily my daughter. Never stepdaughter. Never anything else. My daughter, I agreed. And your father turned them away. That's what happened. She made a sound of disgust. I raised him better than that. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then she said something that surprised me even more. Sarah, do you know what I remember most about that day? No. The look on Emily's face. My throat tightened. Apparently I wasn't the only one who had noticed. Grandma continued quietly. That child looked heartbroken. She was. I know. Another pause. Then, that's when I decided. I knew immediately what she meant. The estate. I closed my eyes. Grandma, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. No. Yes. Her voice became firmer. I watched that family spend years taking your loyalty for granted. I didn't answer, because she wasn't wrong. She knew things most people didn't. She knew about the financial help I'd quietly provided over the years, the mortgage payment I'd made when my parents struggled after Dad's surgery, the tuition assistance for a cousin, the emergency loan to an uncle. I never talked about those things. Neither did she. But she knew. She always knew. Family isn't blood, Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Family is who shows up. I felt tears threatening again. Grandma kept going. When your father needed help, you showed up. When your mother needed help, you showed up. When Michael needed help, you showed up. Her voice softened. When Emily needed a mother, you showed up. I couldn't speak. For years I had wanted someone in my family to understand. Someone to see things clearly. Apparently, Grandma had been watching the entire time. I didn't make these changes to punish anyone, she said. I made them because responsibility belongs with the person who understands what family actually means. The words stayed with me long after we ended the call. That night I finally listened to my father's voicemail. His voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. Less confident. Sarah, call me. No lecture. No excuses. No demands. Just those 2 words. Call me. For the first time in my life, my father sounded afraid, and I was beginning to understand why. The next morning, a certified letter arrived by overnight delivery. It came from Richard Harlan's office. Inside was an invitation. Grandma wanted a family meeting. Everyone. No exceptions. The meeting would take place in Ohio in 3 days. Attendance strongly recommended. I read the letter twice, then looked up at David. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I stared out the window. Toward the falling snow. Toward the long road back to Ohio. Toward the family that suddenly couldn't stop calling. Finally, I folded the letter. I'm going. The drive back to Ohio felt completely different from the first one. 4 days earlier, we'd been carrying wrapped presents and Christmas expectations. Now we were carrying questions. A lot of questions. Nobody knew exactly what Grandma had changed. Nobody knew how extensive the legal revisions were. But judging from the non-stop phone calls, the entire family believed something important had happened. Very important. The closer we got to Ohio, the more messages appeared. My father had stopped calling every hour. Now he called every few hours. That alone told me something. Tom Mitchell was not a patient man. If he was suddenly exercising restraint, it meant someone had advised him to. Probably my mother. Or possibly an attorney. Either way, it wasn't normal. We arrived at Grandma Rose's house shortly before noon. Her home sat on 15 acres outside town. A beautiful white farmhouse surrounded by old maple trees. The place had been the center of our family for decades. Birthday parties, graduations, Thanksgiving dinners. Every major memory seemed connected to that property. Cars already filled the driveway. My parents were there. Michael was there. Several aunts, uncles, and cousins were there. Everyone looked nervous. I noticed something else too. Nobody looked angry. That surprised me. Families facing inheritance disputes usually arrive ready for battle. Instead, people looked worried, almost scared. As soon as I stepped out of the car, conversations stopped. Heads turned. For one uncomfortable moment, every eye focused on me. I hated that. I wasn't interested in being the center of attention. David squeezed my shoulder. You okay? Not really. Me neither. Emily stood beside us quietly. I noticed several relatives smiling at her. A few even waved. The sudden friendliness wasn't lost on me. Apparently being rude to a 14-year-old had become unpopular. Good. They should feel uncomfortable. Inside the house, Grandma sat in her favorite chair near the fireplace. At 86, she still projected authority. Not through volume. Not through intimidation. Just certainty. When Grandma Rose spoke, people listened. Always had. She smiled when she saw us. There's my family. Then she stood up and hugged Emily first. Not me. Not David. Emily. I saw several people notice. Good. Let them notice. After everyone settled into the living room, Richard Harlan arrived carrying several folders. The atmosphere immediately changed. Lawyers have that effect, especially when estates are involved. Mr. Harlan cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. Nobody replied. The silence felt heavy. Professional. Serious. Exactly the way legal meetings often feel. He opened a folder. Mrs. Mitchell recently requested several modifications to her estate plan. My father shifted uncomfortably. Michael crossed his arms. Mom stared at the floor. Mr. Harlan continued. These changes were made voluntarily and with full legal capacity. Translation. Nobody could challenge Grandma's mental competence. The attorney was getting that issue out of the way immediately. Smart man? Among other revisions, he continued, Mrs. Mitchell has appointed a new successor trustee for her estate and charitable foundation. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone already knew what was coming. Still hearing it officially mattered. Mr. Harlan looked down at the document. Sarah Mitchell. The room remained silent. Not shocked. Just resigned. Apparently word had already spread. My father closed his eyes briefly. Michael stared straight ahead. Mom looked like she might cry. I felt strangely uncomfortable. Not triumphant. Not victorious. Just uncomfortable. Because I never asked for this. Never expected it. Never wanted family power. I wanted family love. Unfortunately, those aren't the same thing. Mr. Harlan continued explaining the responsibilities. Trust administration. Asset oversight. Foundation management. Scholarship approval authority. Several legal safeguards. Several financial obligations. The role was substantial. Far more substantial than I had imagined. Then Grandma interrupted. Richard. Yes. Tell them why. The attorney hesitated. Clearly he preferred staying out of family emotions. But Grandma wasn't asking. She was instructing. Finally, he nodded. Mrs. Mitchell specifically requested that her reasoning be included in today's discussion. He opened another document. Then he began reading. I have spent many years observing the people in my family. The room became completely silent. Some share my blood, some do not. I saw Emily listening carefully. I have learned that character matters more than biology. Nobody moved. Nobody even coughed. The person I trust most is the person who consistently serves others without demanding recognition. My stomach tightened. I knew where this was heading. The person who has demonstrated integrity, responsibility, and compassion is my granddaughter, Sarah. I looked down. Suddenly, the floor seemed very interesting. Most importantly, she understands that family is defined by commitment, not genetics. The statement ended. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the only sound came from the fireplace. Crackling logs, burning wood. Then Michael stood up. Not violently, not dramatically, just frustrated. Mom, he looked at Grandma. This is because of Christmas. Grandma didn't blink. Partly. Michael shook his head. One argument changes everything. No. Her voice remained calm. One argument revealed everything. The distinction landed heavily. Because she was right. Christmas hadn't created the problem. It had exposed it. Years of behavior compressed into a single moment. One doorway. One sentence. One choice. Blood family only. Michael looked toward our father. Dad looked away. For the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine embarrassment on his face. Not irritation. Not stubbornness. Embarrassment. Grandma turned toward him. Thomas. He slowly looked up. What exactly did you think would happen? Dad swallowed. Nobody rescued him. Nobody changed the subject. Nobody softened the conversation. For once, he had nowhere to hide. I made a mistake, Grandma nodded. Yes, the single word hit harder than a lecture. I know. Another pause. Then Dad surprised everyone, including me. I didn't think she'd leave. The room went silent again. I stared at him. Of all the explanations I had imagined, that wasn't one of them. Grandma stared too. What? Dad shifted awkwardly. I thought she'd argue. He looked genuinely confused. Almost bewildered. I thought she'd push back. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After 42 years, my father still didn't understand. He thought the problem was that I left. Not that he had excluded my family. Grandma apparently reached the same conclusion, because her expression hardened. Thomas, she shouldn't have had to argue. Nobody spoke. Dad lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed to understand how badly he'd misjudged the situation. And judging from the faces around the room, he wasn't the only one. Nobody left after the meeting. That surprised me. Families usually scatter once lawyers finish talking, especially when inheritance is involved. Instead, people lingered. Some gathered in the kitchen. Others stood near the fireplace. Small conversations broke out throughout the house. The atmosphere felt strange. Not hostile. Not friendly. More like everyone was quietly reevaluating things they had ignored for years. I stepped onto the back porch for some air. The Ohio winter had settled in completely. Snow covered the fields behind Grandma's house. The old red barn stood in the distance exactly as it had when I was a child. Some things changed. Some didn't. The screen door opened behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew who it was. My father. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he joined me at the railing. His hands were shoved into his coat pockets. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. The confident certainty that usually surrounded him seemed thinner somehow. Finally, he cleared his throat. I never expected any of this. I stared at the snowy field. Neither did I. Another silence. Then, your grandmother thinks I'm a terrible person. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it sounded so much like him. Even now, he was focused on how the situation affected him. I don't think that's what she thinks. He looked at me. Then what does she think? I turned toward him. For the first time all day, I answered honestly. I think she believes you hurt people without realizing it. The words hung between us. Dad looked away first. That told me more than any argument could have. When I was younger, conversations like this always ended the same way. He'd become defensive. I'd become frustrated. Mom would intervene. Nothing would change. But today felt different. Maybe because too many people had witnessed what happened. Maybe because Grandma had forced everyone into the open. Or maybe because age eventually catches up with all of us, even stubborn people. I didn't mean to hurt Emily. I studied him carefully. The surprising thing was that I believed him. Not because he was innocent, because he genuinely hadn't considered her feelings. To my father, she had been an abstract idea, a technicality, a stepchild. Not a 14-year-old girl standing 3 feet away. Not a human being. That was the problem. Did you think she wouldn't hear you? He winced. No. Did you think she wouldn't understand? No. Then what exactly did you think would happen? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because there wasn't a good answer. There never had been. The screen door opened again. This time it was Michael. My younger brother looked irritated. Not angry. Irritated. Like a man forced into a conversation he'd rather avoid. Grandma wants everyone inside. Dad nodded. Michael stayed where he was. Then he looked at me. You know, people think this is revenge. There it was. The thing everyone had been thinking but avoiding. I crossed my arms. What people? Family. I laughed softly. Family. The word carried more weight than usual. Michael noticed. His expression tightened. I mean it. I know. You're in charge now. No. He frowned. What? I'm responsible now, that's different. Michael didn't seem convinced. For most of our lives, he had measured success through control. Who got attention? Who got opportunities? Who had influence? Responsibility wasn't something he valued. Power was. Unfortunately, those aren't the same thing either. Grandma gave you everything. I shook my head. No, she didn't. Pretty close. That was when I finally became annoyed. Michael, do you know how much work this is? He blinked. I continued. Do you know how many hours trustees spend dealing with lawyers, accountants, taxes, audits, compliance reviews, and investment reports? Silence. Do you know how much personal liability comes with fiduciary responsibility? More silence. I didn't inherit a prize. His expression changed slightly. Not agreement, understanding. There was a difference. For the first time, he realized this wasn't some movie-style victory. This was work. Serious work. Work Grandma trusted me to do, because she believed I'd actually do it. Inside the house, lunch had been arranged buffet style. People moved through the dining room quietly. The mood remained thoughtful. Aunt Carol eventually approached me. Can we talk? Sure. She looked uncomfortable. I owe you an apology. That caught me off guard. For what? For Christmas. I shrugged. You weren't at the door. No. She looked down. But I was inside. The distinction mattered. A lot. Because that's how family failures usually happen. Not through active cruelty. Through passive silence. I should have said something. I nodded. Maybe? She sighed. I wanted to. That answer felt painfully honest. Many people want to do the right thing. Fewer actually do it. We talked for several minutes. Then another cousin approached. Then an uncle. Then someone else. One conversation after another. A pattern slowly emerged. People had noticed things for years. The favoritism, the dismissive comments, the different standards. Many simply chose not to get involved. Because confronting family is uncomfortable. Because challenging old dynamics creates conflict. Because silence feels easier, until it isn't. Later that afternoon, Grandma asked me to join her in the study. The moment we were alone, she smiled. You're handling this well. I'm trying. You expected something different. I laughed. A little. She nodded knowingly. Revenge isn't nearly as satisfying as people imagine. That statement stayed with me. Because if anyone had earned the right to be bitter, it was probably me. Yet standing there I wasn't. Hurt. Absolutely. Disappointed. Of course. But revenge? Not really. What I wanted wasn't punishment. What I wanted was understanding. Grandma settled into a chair. Then she said something I hadn't expected. Do you know why I chose you? Because of Christmas. She shook her head. No. I frowned. Then why? Because Christmas revealed what I already knew. I sat quietly. She continued. For years I watched people come to you when they needed help. I remembered those moments. The emergency phone calls. The financial requests. The favors. The crises. You always showed up. I smiled faintly. Usually. No. Her eyes met mine. Always. The certainty in her voice caught me off guard. Then she added, even for people who didn't deserve it. That one hurt. Because it was true. More true than I wanted to admit. Grandma reached over and squeezed my hand. The real test isn't how people behave when they have power. I listened carefully. It's how they behave when they finally get it. Outside the study window, snow continued falling. Inside, I realized everyone was waiting to see what I would do next, including my father, including Michael, including Grandma, and maybe even including myself. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else. Old Navy habits die hard. The farmhouse was quiet. Outside, fresh snow covered the fields. Inside, the coffee maker hummed softly in the kitchen. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt calm, not happy, not victorious, just calm. The previous day's meeting had changed something. The truth was finally out in the open. Nobody could pretend anymore. Nobody could claim they didn't know. The family had seen exactly what happened. More importantly, they had seen why Grandma responded the way she did. Now the question wasn't what my father had done. The question was what I would do. By 8 o'clock, people started gathering in the kitchen. My mother was one of the first. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much. Neither had I. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. I should have stopped him. There it was. The sentence I had waited years to hear. Not because it fixed anything, because it acknowledged reality. I looked at her carefully. I know. Tears immediately filled her eyes. He wasn't right. No. I knew he wasn't right. I nodded. Then why didn't you say anything? The question wasn't angry. It was honest. Mom stared into her coffee cup. The answer took a long time to come. Because I've spent 45 years trying to keep peace in this family. I understood exactly what she meant. Women of my mother's generation often carried that burden. Keep the peace. Avoid conflict. Smooth things over. Sacrifice personal truth for family harmony. The problem was that peace built on silence isn't really peace. It's surrender. Mom finally looked up. And somewhere along the way I forgot that protecting people isn't the same thing as protecting relationships. That might have been the wisest thing she had ever said. Later that morning, Grandma asked everyone to gather again. This meeting was different. No lawyers, no documents, no legal discussions, just family. We sat around the living room. The same room where Christmas celebrations had happened for decades. The same room where countless memories had been made. Grandma looked at all of us. Then she smiled. I think everyone is waiting for Sarah to do something. Several people looked uncomfortable. Because she was right. They were. Grandma turned toward me. What are you going to do? The question hung in the room. My father watched carefully. Michael watched carefully. Everyone watched carefully. I took a slow breath, then answered. I'm going to do exactly what you asked me to do. Grandma nodded, which is, manage the trust responsibly. A few people exchanged glances. I continued, I'm going to protect the foundation. Another nod from Grandma. And, I'm going to treat everyone fairly. Silence. Complete silence. Then Michael frowned. What does that mean? I looked directly at him. It means nobody is getting punished. That surprised everyone, including Michael, including my father, including my mother. I could see it on their faces. They had expected consequences, maybe not publicly, but privately. They expected me to remember every slight, every insult, every disappointment. They expected revenge. Instead, I shook my head. I don't want revenge. My father stared at me. I continued. I spent too many years wanting approval. The room remained silent. Then I spent too many years pretending rejection didn't matter. Nobody interrupted. And now I'm too old to waste energy being bitter. Grandma smiled. A small smile, but a proud one. Michael leaned back in his chair. You really mean that? I do. He studied me for a moment, then slowly nodded. For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, we understood each other a little better. That afternoon, people began heading home. One by one, cars disappeared down the snowy driveway. The crowd grew smaller. The tension eased. Eventually, only a handful of us remained. Grandma, my parents, David, Emily, and me. We shared dinner together. Nothing fancy. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, dinner rolls. The kind of meal that appears on millions of American tables every year. Simple, comforting, familiar. At one point, Emily laughed at something David said. The sound filled the room. Grandma smiled immediately. My mother smiled too. Then I noticed something unexpected. My father was smiling, not politely, genuinely, watching Emily, listening to her, seeing her, maybe for the first time. Later that evening after dinner, Emily excused herself to help clear dishes. My father stood up too. I'll help. Everyone froze, not visibly, but enough to notice. Because nobody could remember the last time Tom Mitchell voluntarily helped in the kitchen, including Tom Mitchell. A few minutes later, I walked in and found him standing beside Emily at the sink. The conversation was awkward. Painfully awkward. But it was happening. And that mattered. As I turned to leave, I heard him quietly say, "I'm sorry." Emily looked surprised. "So am I." He swallowed. "No." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry." I stopped walking. Neither of them noticed. Emily stared at him for several seconds, then nodded. "Okay." Just one word. "Okay." Children can be remarkably generous, sometimes more generous than adults deserve. That night, Grandma sat beside me in the living room. Everyone else had gone upstairs. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snow continued falling. "You passed?" I laughed. "Passed what?" "The test." I smiled. "There was a test." "Of course." She sounded amused. "What was the right answer?" Grandma squeezed my hand. "The same answer you've always given." I waited. "Grace." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added something I'll never forget. "Anyone can use power to hurt people." I nodded. "Very few people use power to heal them." The words settled deep inside me. Because she was right. The easiest thing in the world would have been retaliation. The hardest thing was choosing something better. And for the first time in my life, I realized my father understood that too. Spring arrived 3 months later. The snow disappeared. The fields around Grandma's farmhouse turned green again. Life settled into a new routine, at least for a while. I returned to Virginia. David returned to teaching. Emily returned to school. The trust administration work turned out to be exactly as complicated as I had predicted. Lawyers, accountants, investment reports, board meetings, compliance reviews. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting, but it mattered. Every scholarship awarded through Grandma's foundation represented a student receiving an opportunity. Every responsible decision protected something she had spent decades building. I took the responsibility seriously, because Grandma had trusted me, and because trust is one of the few things in life that cannot be replaced once it's broken. The surprising part wasn't the work. The surprising part was my relationship with my family. Slowly things began to change. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Real reconciliation rarely works that way. Instead, it happened through small moments, phone calls, conversations, simple efforts, the kind of things people often overlook. My mother called regularly, not because she needed something, just to talk. Sometimes we'd discuss recipes, sometimes gardening, sometimes absolutely nothing important. The conversations felt different, more honest, less careful. For the first time in years, neither of us seemed interested in pretending. Michael changed too. That one surprised me the most. My brother and I would probably never become best friends. We were simply too different. But we stopped competing, stopped measuring, stopped comparing. Middle age has a way of teaching people what actually matters. And what doesn't. Then there was my father. The hardest relationship. The most important one. For several weeks after Christmas, our conversations remained awkward. Polite. Cautious. Careful. Neither of us quite knew how to rebuild 40 years of misunderstanding. Then one Saturday afternoon he called unexpectedly. "Are you busy?" I smiled. That was always how he started difficult conversations. Not particularly. A long pause followed. Then, "How's Emily doing?" I nearly dropped the phone. Not because the question was extraordinary, because it was. For the first time in his life, my father had called specifically to ask about her. Not me. Not the trust. Not the foundation. Emily. "She's doing well." "Good." Another pause. Then, "Tell her I asked." A small thing. A very small thing. But meaningful. Relationships are repaired the same way they are broken. One moment at a time. One choice at a time. One conversation at a time. Summer arrived. Then early autumn. Grandma remained surprisingly healthy. She attended foundation events, visited friends, played cards, read books, complained about politicians. In other words, she remained exactly herself. One October afternoon, she invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. We sat at a small diner near town. The same diner where generations of local families had eaten pie and drank coffee. Halfway through lunch, she looked at me and smiled. "You know you're still angry." I laughed. "Trust Grandma to notice. Maybe a little." "A little." I nodded. "Sometimes." She stirred her coffee. "That's normal." "I know. What matters is what you do with it." That was classic Grandma. Simple words, complicated truth. I thought about that conversation often afterward. Because forgiveness isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending something never happened. It's choosing not to let the hurt control the rest of your life. A few months later, shortly after Thanksgiving, Grandma passed away peacefully in her sleep. 87 years old. No suffering. No long hospital stay. Just a quiet ending to a remarkable life. The funeral was held in the same church where she had worshipped for decades. People filled every pew. Family, friends, former scholarship recipients, neighbors, community leaders. The turnout said everything. A life measured not by wealth, but by impact. After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall. Stories filled the room. Laughter mixed with tears. Memories passed from one generation to the next. Then something happened that I never expected. My father stood up, tapped a spoon against a glass, and asked for everyone's attention. The room slowly became quiet. Dad looked nervous, more nervous than I had ever seen him. His eyes found mine, then David's, then Emily's. He took a deep breath. "I need to say something." Nobody interrupted. For several seconds he struggled to continue. Then the words finally came. "I spent a lot of years believing family was about blood." The room remained silent. I was wrong. I felt my throat tighten immediately. Dad looked toward David. "You've been a better son than I deserved." David looked stunned. Then Dad turned toward Emily. The room seemed to hold its breath. "And you've always been my granddaughter." Tears instantly filled her eyes. Mine too. Dad swallowed hard. "The fact that it took me so long to understand that is something I'll regret for the rest of my life." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at me. His voice shook. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Years of disappointment. Years of hurt. Years of waiting. All contained in 2 words. I'm sorry. Not an excuse. Not a justification. Not a defense. An apology. A real one." I stood up, walked across the room, and hugged him. The room disappeared. The years disappeared. The anger disappeared. Not completely. Maybe not forever, but enough. Enough to move forward. Enough to begin again. That Christmas, exactly 1 year after everything happened, we gathered at my parents' house. The same doorway, the same family, but something had changed. Before dinner, my father walked over to the fireplace. Several Christmas stockings hung there. One for Mom, one for Dad, one for Michael, one for me. Then he picked up another stocking, a new one, red with white trim. He hung it carefully beside the others. The name stitched across the front read, "Emily." My daughter smiled. My father smiled back. And in that moment, I think Grandma would have been proud. If you've listened this far, maybe this story reminds you of someone. Maybe a parent. Maybe a child. Maybe a wound that never completely healed. Families are complicated. People make mistakes, sometimes very painful ones. But whenever possible, choose honesty over silence. Choose courage over comfort. And choose love over pride. Because blood may create relatives, but character creates family. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about family, forgiveness, resilience, and second chances, you're always welcome to come back and listen again. Drag her out. The judge's voice cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. The gavel slammed. Every head turned toward me. The bailiff took a step forward. Across the room, my father smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an uncertain smile. A victorious one. The kind of smile a man wears when he believes he has finally won after spending 30 years trying. I sat perfectly still. The courtroom in Billings, Montana had gone quiet enough for me to hear the old ceiling fan turning above us. The bailiff reached for my arm. I looked past him and directly at the judge. "Does the name Raven 12 mean anything to you?" The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the bailiff, not my father, not even the court reporter. The judge stared at me as if he'd seen a ghost. Oh my God. His voice was barely a whisper. "You are..." A sudden crash echoed through the room. My father had collapsed. My name is Sarah Whitaker. I was 58 years old that day, and for the first time in my life, my father was afraid. But to understand how we got there, you have to understand the kind of man Frank Whitaker was. To the town of Red Creek, Montana, my father was a respected citizen. Successful rancher, church deacon, Little League sponsor, Veterans Day parade organizer. The kind of man people described as solid. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered birthdays. The kind of man who could charm a room in 5 minutes. People loved him. I used to wish I could. Growing up, I spent years trying. Nothing worked. My younger brother Tommy was everything my father wanted. athletic, outgoing, interested in ranching. Tommy could make one decent tackle during a football game, and Dad would talk about it for weeks. I got straight A's. Dad barely noticed. Tommy bought his first pickup. Dad framed the photo. I earned a scholarship. Dad asked if I was finally done showing off. Those things stay with a child, even when that child becomes an adult. Even when that adult spends decades pretending otherwise. My mother, Evelyn, was different. She saw everything. She never challenged Dad directly. Back then, most women in our community didn't. But she found quiet ways to let me know I mattered. A note in my lunchbox. A phone call after an exam. A hug when Dad wasn't looking. She was the bridge between us. When she died 6 years ago, the bridge disappeared. And whatever little relationship remained between my father and me disappeared with it. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years before the lawsuit arrived. At the time, I was living in Norfolk, Virginia. My life was simple. I owned a small house. I volunteered at the local veterans center. I spent mornings walking near the water and afternoons reading. After years working for the Navy, quiet felt like a gift. Then the certified letter arrived. I remember standing at my kitchen counter opening it. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. Then I read it again. And again. My father was suing me. Not just suing me. Trying to strip me of my ownership rights to the Whitaker Ranch. The ranch had been in our family for generations. When my mother died, I learned something that shocked everyone. She had left me a legal share. Not Tommy. Not Dad. Me. The decision had enraged my father. At the time, I didn't fight. I simply held the deed and moved on. For years, nothing happened. Then suddenly, 6 years later, Dad decided he wanted everything. His lawyers claimed I had abandoned the property. Claimed I had no interest in maintaining it. Claimed I didn't deserve ownership. The lawsuit wasn't about land. I knew that immediately. The acreage was just an excuse. Dad wanted one final victory. One final chance to prove I didn't belong. When I arrived back in Montana, the old town looked exactly the same. The diner still served cinnamon rolls the size of dinner plates. The church bell still rang every Sunday morning. The mountains still stood silently against the horizon. Only I had changed. Age does that. You stop trying to win battles that don't matter. Unfortunately, this one did. Because it wasn't really about me. It was about my mother. The share she left behind was her final statement. Her final act of love. A way of saying, you belong here too. I wasn't going to let my father erase that. The first day in court confirmed my suspicions. The judge and Dad greeted each other by first name. They laughed together before proceedings started. I watched from my seat. Dad didn't even try to hide it. He was comfortable, relaxed, certain. The entire hearing felt predetermined. Every objection from my attorney was dismissed. Every argument from Dad's side was accepted. Hour after hour. The outcome became obvious. Even the spectators seemed to know. By lunch recess, Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in decades. He actually winked at Tommy, like a man celebrating an early victory. That afternoon, things got worse. The judge ruled against nearly every motion we filed. Then he accused me of withholding information. Information that didn't exist. When my attorney protested, he threatened sanctions. I could see where it was heading. The final humiliation. Public removal from the courtroom. Exactly the kind of ending my father would enjoy. And then came the moment. The order. Drag her out. The bailiff stepped forward. My father smiled. I looked at the judge and asked a simple question. Does the name Raven 12 mean anything to you? Everything changed. The judge turned pale. The bailiff froze. My father's smile vanished. And as he collapsed onto the courtroom floor, one thought crossed my mind. For the first time in 30 years, Dad was finally about to learn who his daughter really was. The last thing my father saw before he hit the floor was the expression on the judge's face. I know because I saw it too. For 30 years, Frank Whitaker had believed he understood everything. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who was successful? Who was a disappointment? And most of all, who his daughter was. The moment I said the words Raven 12, that certainty shattered. The courtroom exploded into confusion. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone yelled for a medic. Tommy rushed toward our father. The bailiff abandoned me and moved to assist. But none of that was what caught my attention. I was watching Judge Harold Benson. His hands were trembling. Not slightly. Visibly. The same man who had spent all morning treating me like an inconvenience suddenly looked as though he'd seen something impossible. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he leaned forward. Clear the courtroom. Nobody moved. I said, clear the courtroom. This time everyone listened. The spectators filed out. The attorneys gathered their files. Even the court reporter looked confused. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty. My attorney, Susan Keller, turned toward me. "What the hell just happened?" I gave her a small smile. "Good question." The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure myself. I had expected recognition. I had not expected panic. Susan lowered her voice. "Sarah, who is Raven 12, I looked toward the window overlooking downtown Billings. It's a long story." She waited. I didn't continue. Eventually, she sighed. "You're impossible." That's what my mother used to say. That earned a brief smile. Then the courtroom doors opened again. A paramedic stepped inside. "Mr. Whitaker's stable." Nobody responded. The paramedic looked around awkwardly before leaving. Judge Benson remained seated behind the bench. His eyes never left me. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Whitaker." "I prefer Ms. Whitaker." He nodded. "Ms. Whitaker." Silence filled the room. Then he asked the question everyone wanted answered. "How do you know that designation?" I almost laughed. Designation. Not name, not nickname. Designation. That single word told me everything. He knew exactly what Raven 12 was, or at least enough to be frightened by it. "I'm guessing you know," I replied. His jaw tightened. The judge looked toward my attorney. "Ms. Keller, court is adjourned until Monday." "Monday?" she asked. "That's 4 days away." "Monday." His tone left no room for discussion. The hearing ended. Just like that. No ruling. No decision. No explanation. After everything that had happened, we were simply sent home. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering. Small-town reporters, mostly. People from local papers and radio stations. They surrounded Tommy the moment he emerged. My brother looked exhausted. "Is your father okay? Will the case continue?" "What happened in there?" Tommy ignored them. For once in his life, he genuinely looked lost. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. As Susan and I walked toward the parking lot, a voice called out behind me. "Ma'am." I turned. An older man stood near the courthouse entrance. Late 70s. Gray hair. Weathered face. Federal Marshal retirement pin on his jacket. Something about him felt familiar. He studied me carefully. Then his eyes widened. "I'll be damned." I recognized him a second later. "Marshal Grayson." He laughed softly. "Thought that was you." Susan looked between us. "You two know each other?" The old marshal shook his head. "Not exactly." Then he looked at me. "Been a long time." "Yes, sir." The respect in my voice was genuine. Years ago, our paths had crossed briefly during a federal operation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth discussing. But apparently he remembered. More importantly, Tommy heard everything. My brother had stopped halfway across the parking lot. He was staring. Confused. Concerned. For perhaps the first time in his life, he realized there might be entire chapters of my story he knew nothing about. I wished him luck. There were many. That evening, I drove back to the small motel where I was staying. The same motel I'd used during previous visits. The owner, Martha Jenkins, had known me since high school. She handed me my room key. "Heard about court. News traveled fast in Montana." I smiled. "I'm sure you did." She leaned across the counter. "Your father still stubborn?" I laughed. "Some things never change. Neither do daughters." Her words stayed with me. Upstairs, I sat beside the window overlooking the highway. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. For a while, I simply watched traffic pass. It reminded me of evenings years ago aboard Navy installations. Long days, quiet nights. Time to think. People often assume military service is full of excitement. Most of it isn't. Most of it is paperwork, waiting, sacrifice, distance. The real cost comes later, when you realize entire decades passed while you were somewhere else. My father never understood that. As far as he was concerned, I had abandoned Montana. Abandoned family. Abandoned responsibility. He never asked what I had actually been doing. Never asked where I'd gone. Never asked why. Perhaps because he didn't really want the answer. The next morning proved something had changed. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. "Susan, you need to hear this." I sat up straighter. "What happened?" "I just got off the phone with one of Frank's attorneys." That surprised me. "And apparently your father hired a private investigator last night." I wasn't shocked. That sounded exactly like him. "What did the investigator find?" Susan laughed. Not happily. Nervously. "Nothing." "What do you mean?" "I mean he quit." I frowned. "Quit?" "He refunded the money." Now that got my attention. "Why?" Susan hesitated. "He wouldn't say." That afternoon, however, we got our answer. A friend of Susan's worked in town. By pure coincidence, she'd spoken with the investigator. The man had been visibly shaken. According to her, he'd spent 12 hours trying to research my background. Military records, government records, employment history, everything. Then he abruptly stopped. When Frank demanded an explanation, the investigator said only one thing. One sentence. Nothing more. Nothing less. "I can't help you, Frank." Then he hung up. And from what I later learned, my father stared at that silent phone for a very long time. Because for the first time in his life, Frank Whitaker had encountered something he couldn't control. And it terrified him. By Friday morning, the story had spread across 3 counties. Not because anyone knew what Raven 12 meant. Nobody did. The story spread because people had seen Judge Harold Benson's reaction. In a small Montana town, that was enough. Judges weren't supposed to get rattled, especially not Benson. For 20 years, he'd built a reputation as the calmest man in the room. The fact that he had practically ended the hearing after hearing 2 words from me became the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. The local diner buzzed with theories. The feed store buzzed with theories. The barbershop buzzed with theories. Most of them were ridiculous. I was supposedly a former CIA operative, a witness in a federal mob case, a Pentagon official, a fugitive, an undercover marshal. One theory even suggested I had secretly worked at Area 51. That one made me laugh. The truth was both less exciting and more complicated. But nobody was getting the truth from me. Not yet. I spent Friday afternoon driving out to the ranch. Not because I wanted a confrontation. Quite the opposite. I wanted to see the place my mother loved. The gravel road hadn't changed. Neither had the cottonwood trees lining the entrance. As my truck rolled toward the property, memories surfaced one after another. Summer mornings feeding horses. Winter evenings around the fireplace, my mother humming while she baked pies. For a moment, I wasn't 58. I was 12, and Mom was still alive. The ranch house came into view. A familiar ache settled in my chest. Some places carry memories so deeply that time barely touches them. This was one of those places. I parked near the old red barn. The paint had faded. The roof needed work. Still, it felt like home, or at least the closest thing I had left. I walked toward the fence line where my mother used to sit in the evenings. She'd bring coffee. I'd bring a book. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we wouldn't. Both seemed equally important. Standing there, I suddenly remembered the day she told me she'd changed her will. It had been 15 years earlier. We were sitting beneath the big cottonwood near the creek. I remember protesting immediately. "Mom, Dad's going to lose his mind." She laughed. "He usually does." "I'm serious." "So am I." I can still hear her voice. Soft. Steady. Certain. "Sarah, this isn't about money." "Then what's it about?" She looked toward the pasture. "It's about belonging." At the time, I didn't fully understand. Now I did. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew there would come a day when she wasn't around to remind me I mattered. The land was her way of doing it anyway. Around sunset, I heard another vehicle approaching. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. Tommy. My younger brother parked 20 yards away and climbed out. He looked older than I remembered. The years had not been especially kind to either of us. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence. "You could have called." I smiled faintly. "You could have answered." That ended the conversation before it began. Tommy shoved his hands into his pockets. "Dad's upset." I looked at him. "That's your opening argument." "It's the truth." "So is gravity." He sighed. The same sigh he'd been using since childhood whenever I became difficult. Or perhaps whenever I refused to surrender. "I don't understand why you're doing this." I laughed. That genuinely surprised me. "Doing what?" "Fighting." I stared at him. Then I stared a little longer, because I suddenly realized he meant it. He honestly didn't understand. "You think I'm fighting, aren't you?" "No, Tommy." I shook my head slowly. "Your father sued me." The words hit him harder than I expected. Not because they were new, because they were true. For years, Tommy had acted as though every family conflict somehow involved equal blame, as though fairness required splitting responsibility down the middle. Some situations don't work that way. Sometimes one person creates the problem. Sometimes another person simply refuses to disappear. He looked away. "Dad says you abandoned the family." There it was. The old accusation. The one I'd heard for decades. I took a slow breath. Then I asked a simple question. "When Mom got sick, who paid for her experimental treatment?" Tommy frowned. "What?" "Answer the question." "Dad did." "No." His eyes narrowed. I continued. When the drought nearly cost the ranch 12 years ago who covered the property taxes. Silence. Who paid for Uncle Robert's surgery? More silence. Tommy stared at me. A strange expression crossed his face. Confusion. I reached into my purse, pulled out a folded envelope, handed it to him. Inside were copies of bank records, checks, transfers, receipts, years' worth, quiet contributions, anonymous assistance, emergency payments, thousands and thousands of dollars, all linked to me. Tommy's face slowly changed. He turned pages, then more pages, then more. Finally, he looked up. You did all this? Yes. Why didn't you tell anyone? I almost laughed, because the answer seemed obvious. Mom knew. His throat tightened. That's it. That was enough. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted softly. Finally, Tommy sat down on the fence rail. He looked exhausted, like a man discovering he had misunderstood an entire story. I didn't know. I know. His voice dropped. Dad didn't know either. That earned a sad smile. Tommy. What? He never wanted to know. The difference mattered. A lot. Later that evening, after Tommy left, my phone rang. Susan. Her voice sounded unusually serious. We have a development. I leaned against the porch railing. What kind of development? A lawyer arrived from Washington this afternoon. I frowned. Washington State. No, she paused. Washington, D.C. Now I was interested. What does he want? Nobody knows. Who does he represent? Another pause. That's the strange part. What? Apparently he isn't representing anyone. I looked toward the darkening horizon. Then why is he here? Susan's answer sent a chill through me. According to the hotel clerk, he came to observe Monday's hearing. The line went silent, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I had a feeling Monday was going to be very different. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Montana morning that makes people pull their jackets tighter and drive a little slower. I woke before sunrise, not because I was nervous, because old habits die hard. Years of military service had trained my body to wake before the alarm. I made coffee in the motel room and sat by the window. The parking lot below was empty. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful. Then my phone rang. Susan. Ready? As I'll ever be. She laughed softly. That's not reassuring. I wasn't trying to reassure you. Fair enough. Before hanging up, she added something that caught my attention. The lawyer from Washington is here. Already. He arrived before 7. That was unusual. People don't fly across the country to attend small-town property disputes. Not unless something else is happening. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stared out the window for a long time. Because deep down I knew exactly what was happening. The problem wasn't Raven 12. The problem was recognition. There are moments in life when a single word reaches the wrong ears. And suddenly people start remembering things they'd rather forget. The courthouse looked different that morning. Busier. Tenser. People gathered outside before the doors even opened. Reporters had doubled since Thursday. The local radio station was broadcasting from the sidewalk. Everyone wanted answers. Nobody had any. As I walked toward the entrance, conversations stopped. People stared. I wasn't famous. I wasn't important. But I had become the center of a mystery. And people love mysteries. Inside the courthouse, security seemed tighter than before. Even the deputies looked uncomfortable. One of them recognized me. His expression immediately changed. Not fear. Respect. The kind that comes from hearing rumors you don't fully understand. I nodded politely and continued inside. When I entered the courtroom, my father was already there. So was Tommy. Neither looked rested. Frank Whitaker looked 10 years older than he had 4 days earlier. His collapse hadn't been a heart attack. The doctors later called it a stress-induced episode. His body had simply reached its limit. For years, he had controlled every room he entered, every conversation, every relationship. Then suddenly he found himself facing something he couldn't understand. It was eating him alive. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. That alone told me everything. My father had never looked away before. Not once. A few minutes later, Judge Benson entered. The entire room stood, then sat. The difference was immediate. Thursday's judge had been confident, relaxed, almost arrogant. Monday's judge looked like a man carrying a burden. He shuffled papers unnecessarily, adjusted his glasses repeatedly, avoided eye contact. The courtroom noticed. So did my father. And that worried him more than anything else, because Dad had spent his entire life reading people. He knew fear when he saw it. The hearing began. For several minutes, nobody mentioned Raven 12. Instead, we discussed property boundaries, inheritance law, tax records, routine legal matters. But everyone knew we were simply circling the real issue. Eventually, Judge Benson stopped speaking. He looked directly at me, then at my attorney, then back at me. Finally, he asked, "Ms. Whitaker," his voice sounded careful, very careful, "would you be willing to clarify your statement from Thursday?" The room became silent. I folded my hands. "What statement?" "You know which one." I did, but I wanted him to say it. The judge hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Raven 12. Across the room, my father visibly tensed. Tommy leaned forward. The reporters began scribbling notes. I took a slow breath, then answered honestly, "Probably not." The judge frowned. "Probably. Most of it isn't mine to discuss." That was true. And everyone could hear it, the difference between refusing and being unable. The judge understood immediately. So did the man from Washington. I noticed him for the first time sitting near the back row. Mid-60s. Expensive suit. Federal posture. Watching everything. Saying nothing. The hearing paused for recess shortly before noon. As people filtered into the hallway, something unexpected happened. Judge Benson approached me privately. Not as a judge, as a man. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he spoke. "I haven't heard that designation in almost 30 years. I studied him carefully. "Neither have I." His expression darkened. "I was a federal prosecutor back then." There it was. Finally. A piece of the puzzle. The judge continued. "There was an operation." I said nothing. He nodded. "Most records disappeared." "Yes. Most people involved disappeared too." "Also true." The judge swallowed hard. His voice lowered. "Some of us believed everyone connected to it was gone. Now I understood his reaction. Not fear. Shock. The same kind of shock you'd feel if someone walked into a room after being presumed dead for decades. The problem was that nobody had actually thought I was dead. What disappeared wasn't the people. It was the story. The records. The names. The memories. The entire operation had quietly faded into history. Exactly as intended." The judge looked exhausted. "Why bring it up now?" For the first time, I smiled sadly. "Because my father spent 30 years pretending I was nobody." Judge Benson glanced toward the courtroom, toward Frank Whitaker, then back at me. And suddenly he understood. This was never about classified programs, never about government secrets, never about national security. It was about a daughter. A daughter whose own father never cared enough to ask where she had been. When recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. The atmosphere had changed. The mystery remained, but the focus was shifting. People were beginning to realize the story wasn't Raven 12. The story was Frank Whitaker, and the daughter he never bothered to know. The hearing resumed. My attorney presented evidence. Financial records, property documents, historical ownership records. Then she introduced something new. A collection of payments, medical bills, emergency expenses, tax records, all linked to me, all connected to helping the family over the years. The courtroom grew quiet. Tommy looked stunned. Again, my father looked worse. Each document felt like another brick removed from the wall he'd built around himself. The wall that said I didn't care, that I had abandoned everyone, that I owed nothing, and received nothing. The truth was far less convenient. For years I had helped quietly, without credit, without acknowledgement, without expectation, because my mother would have wanted it that way. When Susan finished, silence filled the room. My father stared at the documents, then at me. For the first time in decades, he looked confused. Not angry, not defensive. Confused. Like a man discovering he had been reading the wrong map his entire life. Then suddenly his hand moved to his chest. Tommy noticed first. "Dad!" Frank didn't answer. His face had gone pale. The courtroom erupted into motion, and as doctors rushed toward him, I realized something important. My father wasn't collapsing because of Raven 12. He was collapsing because the truth finally weighed more than the lies. The second collapse happened in complete silence. One moment my father was sitting at the plaintiff's table. The next he was gripping his chest. His face had gone gray. Not pale. Gray. The kind of color that instantly makes everyone in the room understand something is wrong. "Dad," Tommy was already moving. The judge stood. The bailiff called for medical assistance. People rushed forward. For a few seconds, nobody cared about lawsuits, property rights, or courtroom procedure. They cared about a 79-year-old man struggling to breathe. I remained seated, not because I didn't care, Because I couldn't move. I was watching the strongest man from my childhood suddenly look fragile, and no matter how complicated our history had become, that was difficult to see. Very difficult. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They stabilized him and transported him to St. Vincent Regional Hospital. The hearing ended immediately. No objections, no arguments, no complaints, just silence. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it actually was. Susan offered to come. I declined. This wasn't a legal matter anymore. It was family. And family has a way of becoming complicated when nobody is billing by the hour. By the time I arrived, Tommy was sitting alone in the waiting room. His elbows rested on his knees. His hands were clasped together. He looked exhausted. When he saw me, he didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Finally, he shook his head. I don't understand any of this. I sat beside him. I know. No, I mean it. He looked genuinely defeated. Everything I thought I knew keeps turning out wrong. I stared at the floor tiles. For once, I had no clever response. Because I understood exactly how he felt. Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't learning new information. It's realizing old information was never true. A doctor eventually appeared. Middle-aged. Calm. Professional. He'll be fine. Tommy exhaled so hard it almost sounded painful. The doctor continued. Stress played a major role. I almost laughed at that. If stress could be measured like rainfall, my father had spent decades standing in a hurricane. The doctor left. Tommy remained silent. Then he looked at me. Will you see him? The question surprised me. A week earlier, I would have answered no, without hesitation, without guilt. Now I wasn't sure. Eventually, I nodded. Yes. My father looked smaller in a hospital bed. It's strange how illness can do that. The same man who once seemed larger than life now appeared ordinary. Just another elderly patient attached to monitors. Just another man growing old. When I entered the room, he was awake. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other, neither knowing where to begin. Finally, he spoke. You're still here. His voice sounded weak. I pulled a chair closer. Apparently. A faint smile appeared, then disappeared. The room became quiet again. Outside, I could hear distant hospital activity. Nurses walking, phones ringing, life continuing. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. Tommy told me about the money. I said nothing. He showed me the records. Still nothing. My father looked toward the window. You paid for your mother's treatment. Yes. You helped the ranch. Yes. More than once. Yes, the answers came easily. The silence afterward didn't. Because neither of us knew what to do with the truth. Finally, he asked the question that mattered. Why? I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the age lines. The gray hair. The exhaustion. And suddenly I saw something I'd never noticed before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of regret. I loved Mom. My answer was simple. It mattered to her. His eyes closed. For a moment I thought he might cry. Instead he nodded, slowly, as though absorbing something painful. Then he asked another question, the one everyone had wanted answered. Were you some kind of spy? Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in days. My father looked offended. What? I shook my head. That's what you're worried about. People keep talking. It's a small town. That isn't an answer. No. He waited. I waited. Eventually he sighed. So what were you? The room grew quiet. I could have told him about assignments. Operations. Classifications. Years spent serving in places he never knew existed. I could have explained Raven 12. At least the parts I was allowed to explain. But suddenly none of it seemed important. Not anymore. So I gave him the only answer that mattered. I was your daughter. The words landed harder than any secret ever could. I watched them hit him. Watched understanding slowly replace confusion. For years my father had focused on what I did. Where I went. What title I held. What records existed. What records didn't. And in doing so, he missed something obvious. The person standing in front of him. His daughter. Nothing else should have mattered. Yet somehow everything else had. His eyes filled with tears. The sight stunned me. Frank Whitaker didn't cry. At least not when I was growing up. I never saw it happen. Not once. Now tears sat openly in his eyes, and he made no attempt to hide them. I failed you. The words were barely audible. I looked away. Not because I disagreed. Because hearing them hurt more than I expected. The child inside me had waited decades for that apology. Now that it finally arrived, I wasn't sure what to do with it. My father continued. I kept thinking you'd come back and become who I wanted. I stared at the floor. When that didn't happen, his voice cracked. I got angry. Neither of us spoke. The monitors quietly beeped beside the bed. Finally, he whispered something that changed everything. I treated you like an enemy. The honesty caught me off guard, because it was true. Painfully true. For years, every success I'd achieved somehow offended him. Every accomplishment became evidence I was leaving. Every choice became a rejection. Not because I hated him, because I was becoming myself. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. His shoulders sagged, years of stubborn pride finally collapsing. Then came the question, the hardest one. Can you forgive me? The room felt very still. I thought about childhood, about my mother, about years of silence, about all the things we'd lost. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It doesn't happen instantly. Not real forgiveness. Real forgiveness takes time, patience, honesty. Sometimes more than one conversation. So I didn't lie. I didn't offer a dramatic speech. I didn't give him the ending he wanted. Instead, I reached over and adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder, the same way my mother used to. Then I stood. And before leaving the room, I quietly said, I came to the hospital, didn't I? For the first time all day, my father smiled. Not a victorious smile. Not a proud smile. Just a hopeful one. And somehow that felt like a beginning. 3 months later, I stood on the front porch of the Whitaker Ranch and watched the sun rise over the Montana hills. The morning air carried the scent of grass and distant rain. A herd of cattle moved slowly across the eastern pasture. Nothing seemed different. And yet everything was, the lawsuit was over. Not because somebody won. Because eventually nobody wanted to keep fighting. After my father's hospitalization, something shifted. Not immediately. People like Frank Whitaker don't change overnight. Neither do daughters who spent decades protecting themselves, but little things began happening. Conversations, questions, moments. The kinds of moments families usually have years earlier. We were having them at 79 and 58. Late was still better than never. The legal resolution surprised almost everyone. Including my attorneys, the evidence had become overwhelming. The ranch records were clear. My mother's will was clear. The financial records were clear. If the case continued, I would almost certainly win. Completely. My father knew it. His attorneys knew it. The judge knew it. So 1 week after leaving the hospital, my father called. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. But it changed everything. I want to settle. I stood in my Virginia kitchen holding the phone. What kind of settlement? A long silence followed. Then he answered. The honest kind. For once there were no conditions. No tricks. No hidden demands. No attempts to control the outcome. Just honesty. It felt strange. Almost unfamiliar. The final agreement gave me exactly what my mother intended. My legal share remained intact. No reduction. No compromise. No surrender. After 30 years, I had finally stopped letting my father decide my value. That alone felt like victory. But then came a second decision. One nobody expected. Including my father. Including Tommy. Including me. Because after the paperwork was completed, I spent several nights thinking about what came next. The easy option would have been selling. Many people advised it. Take the money. Walk away. Close the chapter. Move on. A younger version of me might have done exactly that. But age changes your perspective. You begin measuring success differently. At 25, I wanted justice. At 58, I wanted peace. They are not always the same thing. One afternoon, I drove to the ranch alone. I walked the property for nearly 3 hours. Past the creek. Past the cottonwoods. Past the fence where Mom and I used to sit. Every corner held memories. Some painful. Some beautiful. Most of them both. By sunset, I had made my decision. I wasn't selling. I wasn't seeking revenge. And I wasn't fighting anymore. Instead, I created something new. The Evelyn Whitaker Conservation Trust. Named after my mother. The woman who quietly held our family together long after she was gone. The trust protected the land from future development. Protected the wildlife habitat. Protected the ranch itself. Future generations could still work it. Still live on it. Still belong there. The way Mom always wanted. When I explained the idea to Tommy, he stared at me for nearly a full minute. Then he laughed. You realize most people would have burned the place down by now. I smiled. Good thing I'm not most people. He nodded. Mom would have liked this. That meant more than he realized. By autumn, life settled into something resembling normal, or perhaps a new version of normal. The kind older people eventually learned to appreciate. No grand dramatic reconciliation. No movie ending. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were small things. Phone calls, coffee, conversations, the occasional awkward silence. Those mattered more. One October afternoon, I returned to Montana again. The leaves had turned gold. The mountains stood sharp against a blue sky. As I approached the ranch house, I spotted my father sitting on the porch, alone. A blanket rested across his lap. For a moment, I simply watched him. The man looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just older. Age eventually humbles everyone. Even Frank Whitaker. Especially Frank Whitaker. I climbed the porch steps carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked up. "You're late." I handed him a cup. "You sound healthier." "Doctor says I'm difficult." I laughed. "That diagnosis isn't new." A smile appeared. "The genuine kind." We sat quietly, watching the property, watching the afternoon drift by, neither rushing to fill the silence. For the first time in our lives, silence didn't feel hostile. It felt comfortable. Eventually, children appeared near the pasture. Tommy's grandchildren. My grandnieces and grandnephews, running, laughing, chasing each other through the grass. My father watched them carefully. Then he spoke. "You know what bothers me most?" I looked over. "What?" He took a long sip of coffee. I wasted a lot of years. The honesty didn't surprise me anymore. 3 months ago it would have. Not now. I nodded. "Yeah." Another silence followed. Then he added something unexpected. "I'm glad I got a few back." The words hung between us. Simple, unpolished. True. I looked toward the horizon. The same horizon my mother had loved. The same one she'd watched while imagining a future neither of us could see yet. Maybe she knew something we didn't. Maybe she understood that healing isn't dramatic. It's gradual, quiet, built one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one act of grace at a time. The sun began sinking behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Beside me, my father sat quietly. Not healed completely. Neither was I. Some scars remain. That's part of being human. But we were finally facing the same direction. And for now, that was enough. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, someone you've lost, forgiven, misunderstood, or perhaps still hope to reconnect with, take a moment and think of them today. And if you believe that understanding can arrive even after years of silence, feel free to share your thoughts below. Stories like these remind us that sometimes the most important conversations happen later than we planned, but they still matter. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to hear more stories about family resilience and second chances, I'd be honored if you joined us again.